I'm Carol Allman Morton, the Executive Director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Berkshire Community College. Tonight, we have partnered with our friends at the OLLI at the University of Richmond, Virginia, to offer this incredible program. We are so grateful to Dorothy Canter and Bill Hafker for reaching out to us to propose this program and for their partnership. If you would like to learn more about programming at OLLI at BCC and at the OLLI at the University of Richmond, you can check out our websites, and I'm going to put them in the chat right now. There you go. And now I'm going to turn things over to Alan Spears, who will be our moderator tonight. Thank you so much, Alan.
Carol, thank you so much. It's great to be here with you. My name is Alan Spears. I'm the Senior Director for Cultural Resources at the National Parks Conservation Association. NPCA serves as the leading voice of the American people on behalf of their national parks. And we were established in 1919 by the first director of the National Park Service, Stephen Ting Mather, who understood even in that early period that national parks were going to need a citizen watchdog, work dog group to protect them and keep them in good shape. You can learn more about who we are and what we do by visiting our website at www.npca.org. Now, we're gathered here this evening to talk about a remarkable man, Julius Rosenwald, the most important philanthropist you've never heard of, and an ongoing campaign to designate a new national park to commemorate his legacy. I am joined by three friends for this presentation, and each brings a passion and expertise to this subject matter and to this work. We're going to hear from each of them, and then we'll join everyone together for a conversation. We will have opportunity for questions from the folks that are participating or attending this seminar, and we will hope to round out this conversation right around 8:30 or so. So we look forward to the presentations and to engagement with folks. And if we don't get to your questions or comments tonight, we'll try to handle them after things conclude. Dr. Dorothy Canter is an expert in the decontamination of bioterrorism agents and in responding to and recovering from attacks with weapons of mass destruction. She played an important role in the fumigations of contaminated buildings following the 2001 anthrax attacks. She's published widely on anthrax remediation and risk assessment. Before her retirement, she was the principal of Dorothy Canter Consulting, LLC. She also served as a senior professional biophysicist at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. She worked for the federal government for 29 years, the last 15 of which at the Environmental Protection Agency, where she served as the chief scientist for bioterrorism issues from November 2001 until June 2005. Dr. Canter received both a BS in mathematics and a Ph.D. in biophysics from the George Washington University. Go Colonials. She has been a volunteer for the National Parks Conservation Association for 32 years, serving on the board of trustees for 9 years and in multiple other capacities. She is currently the president of the campaign to establish the Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Historical Park. She was one of the founders of the Friends of Fort Hunt Park in Alexandria, Virginia, and she has visited 320 national park units. I get the sense we might need to update that number. Next on our team tonight is Mr. Robert G. Stanton, former senior advisor to the Secretary of the U.S. Department of the Interior and former director of the National Park Service. He's a consultant and lecturer in natural and cultural resource preservation. He was appointed by President Obama in 2014 to serve as a member of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, an independent federal agency. He is active in professional and civic affairs. Mr. Stanton earned a Bachelor of Science degree from Huston-Tillotson University and did his graduate work at Boston University. He began his federal career as a seasonal park ranger at Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming during the summers of 1962 and 1963, an opportunity made possible through the leadership of Interior Secretary Lee Udall. Over the course of his career, he has held various management and executive positions, including park management assistant, superintendent, deputy regional director, assistant director, associate director, and director. An experienced public administrator, Mr. Stanton in 1997 was unanimously confirmed by the United States Senate as the 15th director of the National Park Service, the first African American to serve in this position. He served as the director until the end of the Clinton administration in 2001. Prior to returning to federal service in 2009, Mr. Stanton served as an executive professor at Texas A&M University in the Department of Recreation, Park and Tourism Sciences, visiting professor at Howard University in the Department of History, Public History Programs, Go Bison, visiting professor of practice at Yale University in the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, board member, and a consultant to a number of national conservation organizations. From 2001 through 2003, he served as the International Union for Conservation and Nature's ambassador for the 5th World Parks Congress held in 2003 in Durban, South Africa. During his decades of public service, he received 5 honorary doctorate degrees and numerous achievement awards, including the Department of the Interior's highest award, the Distinguished Service Award. A native of Fort Worth, Texas, he grew up in Mosier Valley during the era of separate but equal. Mosier Valley is one of the oldest communities in Texas, founded by African Americans shortly after the Civil War. Stephanie Deutsch is the author of You Need a Schoolhouse, Booker T. Washington, Julius Rosenwald, and the Building of Schools for the Segregated South, published by Northwestern University Press. Since the book came out in 2011, she has been a frequent speaker at Rosenwald School alumni events, at public and private schools, and at Q&A sessions after the documentary film Rosenwald. She is a frequent contributor to her neighborhood newspaper, and her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Millions blog. She is currently at work on a book about men and women whose work was supported by Julius Rosenwald Fellowships. Stephanie lives in Washington, D.C., where for 20 years she served as chairman of the Grants Committee of the Capitol Hill Community Foundation, which raises and gives away $350,000 a year in small grants. She is married to retired television director David Deutsch, a great-grandson of Julius Rosenwald, and she is the mother of 4 grown children and grandmother to 5 little boys. These are our guests. Stephanie, we want to start with you. Take it away, please.
Thank you, Alan. Gosh, I really enjoyed those intros. I was aware that I had illustrious colleagues in this project, and we've all been so fortunate that we've all become friends. But it's awesome to be reminded of how accomplished everyone is. This story, the story of Julius Rosenwald and the schools, really is an inspiring one, and it's been a real joy for those of us who've been doing this for several years, to have the privilege of sharing this story and seeing the ramifications that it still is having today. Rosenwald was kind of an archetypal figure in some ways. He was the son of German Jewish immigrants. He grew up in Springfield, Illinois, right across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home. But he was born in 1862, so Lincoln was not there. But he grew up in Springfield, working weekends in his father's clothing store, getting his training in Judaism in the Reform Temple that his father was one of the founders of the temple in Springfield, was a bar mitzvah there, did well in school, but never graduated from high school because at 16, he left and moved to New York City, where his mother's brothers, his uncles, were in the clothing trade. They were both manufacturing and selling, retailing. So he learned all aspects of the clothing trade. Came back to the Midwest to start a company with his brother manufacturing men's clothing. They settled in Chicago. And in 1895, he had the chance to buy into a small, unknown mail order company called Sears Roebuck. And with young people, one is in some danger that they might not know about Sears, but I suspect this group, everyone will have the experience of, oh yeah, the Sears catalog. I grew up looking at that. Sears was definitely a case of the right business at the right time. Richard Sears was an advertiser and promoter of genius, very imaginative guy, but Julius Rosenwald brought the managerial skills that he desperately needed to make this company work. And so the combination of the two of them and just the boom in manufacturing, and Sears was tremendously successful. And Julius, by the time he was a little over 40, was wealthy beyond anything he could ever have imagined. From his Jewish heritage, he had a strong sense of social responsibility, of tzedakah, of giving that is motivated not just by charity, not by love or affection, but by a sense of justice, and also by a desire to empower the receiver. And so he grew up, as he became accustomed to the fact that he was wealthy, he was thinking very, very seriously about philanthropy. That was always something that was going to be part of his life. Also, from events around him in the first decade of the 20th century, he was beginning to equate the racial animus in this country with the anti-Semitism and the lack of opportunity that had driven his parents, and of course, so many other Jews, to leave Europe. And all this was reinforced for him because in 1908, there was a 3-day race riot in Springfield, Illinois, his hometown. And this is at the same time that he and other American Jews, are raising money to send to Europe for victims of pogroms. They're very aware of what's going on in Europe. And so Julius's attention was really grabbed by this. In 1911, one of his colleagues gave him a copy of Up From Slavery, which is Booker T. Washington's powerful memoir of growing up enslaved on a farm, a small family farm, not a plantation as we often think of slavery. This was a small family farm in the western part of Virginia. And his longing for education, despite he was 9 when his family was emancipated, but even then he had to work in a coal mine and a salt mine to help his family. Fortunately, he also worked for a woman who had been a teacher and encouraged him very much. And he was able to go to Hampton Institute, which was a school that had been founded. It is now, of course, a very prestigious historically Black college, but it had been founded by the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War to educate teachers. And so Booker T. Washington went there, was educated, and was successful, was so successful that a few years later, when the president of Hampton was asked to recommend someone to go down to Alabama to start a school similar to Hampton to educate teachers, the people down in Alabama had asked for a white man, but General Armstrong, the president of Hampton, wrote recommending Booker T. Washington and saying, "I know of no white man who could do better." In 1881, Booker T. Washington, age 25, goes down to Tuskegee. It's a small town about 40 miles west of Montgomery. And with this small stipend from the state of Alabama, he starts this school. And right from the start, he was just incredibly successful at what he did. He had a gift for public speaking, and he traveled widely to encourage people to donate to the school. He cultivated white donors, of whom there were some. And so by the time Rosenwald and Washington meet in 1911, each of them is very successful. They meet in Chicago. Washington comes to a luncheon that Julius Rosenwald hosts, and the two men like each other, and I think really recognize something in each other. They're kind of similar sorts of men. They're very action-oriented. They're very can-do. And so Rosenwald invites Washington out to tour the state-of-the-art. Sears has just completed a massive campus plant on Chicago's western side. And so Julius takes Washington to tour there. takes him to lunch in the executive dining room. So Washington says, okay, now you got to come down and see Tuskegee. And so in the fall of 1911, Julius Rosenwald filled a private railroad car with friends and relatives from Chicago. He takes his rabbi, Emil Hirsch. He takes his good friend, Jane Addams, well known because of Hull House, and various others. And they travel down to Tuskegee and they spend 3 days on the campus. And they're incredibly impressed by what they see there. The campus is beautiful. It's been built by the students of bricks they make there. It's a very large school, and they're impressed and they're also moved. The last night of their visit, there's a chapel service in the beautiful chapel on the campus, and they hear what Washington used to refer to as plantation songs, what we now call spirituals, music that they had never heard, that there was no radio, there was no, they had never heard this. And it really helped convey to them the reality of the lives of these people they were meeting. So Rosenwald agrees to serve on the board of Tuskegee, but he also enters into a conversation with Washington about, well, what more could I do? Washington starts telling him that there are many places in the South, especially rural places, where there are simply no schools. Public education is mandatory in all the states, but the states divide their money very unequally between Black systems and white. And there are so many places where the people themselves, the African Americans themselves, are raising money. These are not wealthy people, but they desperately, desperately want schools. So in honor of his 50th birthday in 1912, Julius Rosenwald gave away a large amount of money, $600,000. 25,000 of that went to Tuskegee. Well, Booker T. Washington suggested, why don't we take just a little bit of that, 2,500, and we'll use it to build 6 schools right around Tuskegee. Each school would receive $300 from Rosenwald, $300 from the community, and then this school would be given to the public school system, which would administer it. From that start, from those 6 original schools, grew a program that by the time Rosenwald died in 1932, it had provided over 5,000 schools, shop buildings, and teachers' homes in 15 states, and was educating about 1/3 of the African-American children in the South. And as a result of this program, the states themselves had stepped up a little more to their responsibilities. They had become by far the largest contributor to the cost of the schools, but amazingly, dollar for dollar, the Rosenwald Fund actually contributed less than the people, the men and women in the communities the schools were built to serve. And of course, these were not wealthy people. They were sharecroppers, they were farmers, they were domestic workers, and they gave land, they gave labor, they gave money that they raised with community fish fries and contribution drives. It's a remarkable story of determination and generosity. So I'll now turn it over to Bob to pick up the story from his perspective, and then we'll get back to a conversation.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Let me hasten to express my appreciation to the sponsors who have made our participation in this webinar possible. And it certainly is an honor and privilege to be joined by our distinguished leader, Dr. Dorothy Canter, my colleagues Stephanie and Alan. And I think it can be said that we mutually share a passion for the ultimate creation of a National Historical Park commemorating the rich and enduring legacy of Mr. Rosenwald and the Rosenwald schools. As Alan graciously pointed out, in his introduction. I served some 41 years with the federal government, of which 35 years were with the National Park Service. But also, Alan underscored the fact that I grew up under that insidious doctrine, and yes, I said insidious, because it was an insidious doctrine of separate but equal, and there was absolutely nothing equal under that doctrine as I experienced it in my staunchly segregated home state of Texas. With the backdrop of my experiences in the National Park Service and growing up in segregated schools, elementary and high school in Texas, that really has buoyed my passion for our recognizing as a people and as a nation the contributions made by Mr. Rosenwald and others. I would offer 2 or 3 perspectives drawing from my background. And as I have looked at and reviewed in depth the importance of the Rosenwald schools, their benefits are, in a real sense, immeasurable. But they're better known, perhaps, of the products that they have produced, the students themselves, in terms of their ascending to areas of leadership. And one who comes to mind, which is, I think, I could say without any hesitation, is a hero of us all, a young boy from Troy, Alabama, who attended a Rosenwald school, who became one of the most revered members of the United States Congress. He left us all too soon a few years back. I speak of none other than Congressman John Robert Lewis, a graduate of a Rosenwald school in Troy, Alabama. But as I again reflect on the importance of the contribution of Mr. Rosenwald, I also would have to think about the parents, the guardians, and the communities that supported meeting the matching of 1/3 finances required to build a school in a given community. The courage of the parents, the courage of the guardians of the community to take exception to the general view that these young kids should be in the cotton fields or the hay fields or the tobacco fields working and not spending all of their time being educated. But they took the risk that we will have a school to serve the needs of our children. And certainly the importance of the school districts and with their finances and state resources to the extent that they were available, came together in a tricle, if you will, to meet the educational needs of the young people. But what cemented that tricle, those tri-relationship, was the thirst on the part of the children to avail themselves to the educational opportunities that the Rosenwald School would afford. So when we think about commemorating the legacy of Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald schools, we have to think in terms of Mr. Rosenwald, the parents, the guardians of the community, and certainly the children who really were the beneficiaries of that commitment. With respect to the National Park Service being involved in preserving and telling the story of educational opportunities throughout our country under the doctrine of separate but equal, the Park Service is not a stranger. The Park Service has responsibility for the Brown versus Board of Education, that's a historical site, and the 4 areas in addition to Brown that are commemorated in that historical park in Virginia, in Delaware, Washington, D.C., South Carolina. All were part of the case. There were 5 cases heard by the Supreme Court in 1954, in which it held unanimously that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. But as we all know, we were not too eager, unfortunately, as a people in a nation, to embrace the letter and spirit of that Supreme Court decision. So our will was put on display in the Little Rock Central High School historical site, which tells the story that 9 of my peers had to be protected to exercise their rights to enter their school, protected by the U.S. military as authorized by President Dwight David Eisenhower. But the story does not end there. One of the more recent parks added to the system was Blackwell Elementary School in my home state of Texas, a school dedicated to the education of Latinos. And yes, Latinos suffered segregation in public schools as well as African Americans during the doctrine of separate but equal. But we also tell the story about one of the earlier historically Black colleges, which closed shortly after the 54 Supreme Court decision in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. Story College, Mr. Frederick Douglass was a member of the Board of Trustees. That story is told there, and the buildings are preserved as a part of the historical park. So the Park Service will not be a stranger in terms of preserving schools, elementary, high school, or colleges and universities. But I think that the story, the enduring and the rich story of the Rosenwald School will broaden our understanding of the importance of education and how the American people have evolved to understand that educational opportunities should be available to every one of our youth, which is the most cherished, the most rich of all the resources entrusted to the people of the United States are our youth. In the words again of Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, we have a responsibility to our youth, for they have a thirst for education, and we should try to support their quenching that thirst. Again, on behalf of my colleagues with the Rosenwald campaign, I want to thank the sponsors for this opportunity, and I look forward to the day in which the president will sign into public law a measure passed by the United States Congress establishing the Rosenwald and the Rosenwald School National Historical Park, where that story will be told in perpetuity by your National Park Service. Again, thank you for this great opportunity. Now we'll turn it over to our leader, our tireless leader, Dr. Dorothy Canter. Dorothy.
Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Alan. And thank you very much to OLLI, Berkshire Community College, and to the OLLI University of Richmond that are sponsoring this tonight. I may be tireless, but right now I'm pretty tired. Stephanie and Bob have told you about Julius Rosenwald and the Rosenwald schools, and that's a very important part of the Julius Rosenwald story. There's more to his story, and tonight maybe we'll have time to go into it in more depth during the panel session. But let me just say very quickly about that before I go on to talk about the campaign to create the Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Historical Park. In 1917, Julius Rosenwald created his own foundation called the Julius Rosenwald Fund, which was dedicated to the well-being of mankind. And the schools were very important for the first 11 years of that fund. But he broadened the fund to include both education and to improving African-American health and also racial relations. And one of the programs that he established and that was carried out after his death by the President Edwin Embry was a fellowship program. And in that program, fellowships were given to 900 highly talented people, mostly in the early parts of their career, but not all, because W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the recipients. He received 3 awards. And of these 900 people, 2/3 were African-American. And it reads like a who's who's list. And when the park is established, that will be part of what is interpreted in the park. The fund also contributed to HBCUs, and 12 of the Rosenwald Fellows worked under Thurgood Marshall on the second brief for the Brown versus Board of Education lawsuit, which Bob has mentioned. So it's a very, a lot there to talk about. And also, and I'll mention it a little bit in my talk, how he ran Sears and how he ran his philanthropy. Both were very results oriented. He also gave very generously to Jewish causes. And even before he met Booker T. Washington, Rosenwald first he was giving to the YMCA in Chicago. They came to him and said, will you help fund the construction of a YMCA for African Americans? Because in those days, in 1910, there was no place to go. If you didn't have family, you were in big trouble if you were African American. And when they came to ask him that, he said, well, I'll tell you what, I will give $25,000 to each city in this country that will raise $75,000 independently to build a YMCA. And when that program ended in 1932, there were 27 YMCAs and there were 24 YMCAs and 2 YWCAs. And that may be what put Julius Rosenwald on the radar of Booker T. Washington, who not only was an important educator, he was an amazing fundraiser. So now I will go to my presentation on creating the national park, and I'm going to share the screen and let's get it. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to talk about creating the national park. And so how did this all begin? As a matter of fact, one of our board members, when I first met him, before he was a board member, I met him in Chicago, and he said, what's a scientist doing trying to create a national park? And that always amused me because why not? I love national parks, and I love to listen to Bob talk about national parks. By the way, Bob is the first one I met back in 1989. I met Alan in the early 2000s, and I met Stephanie by serendipity because she's a very important member of the board. When I was telling a friend that I am interested in creating a campaign to have this park created, he said, oh, you have to meet Stephanie Deutsch. She wrote this book, You Need a Schoolhouse. So how did it all begin? I don't know. I have on my screen a lot of words. I hope it's not on your screens as well.
It looks perfect.
Great, thank you. So in 2015, September, a little more than 7 years ago, time flies, my late husband and I wanted to see a movie in Washington, D.C., and we didn't know what to see. And when I looked at the Washington Post weekend section, and there was about a review of this documentary called Rosenwald. And it was produced by a local DC filmmaker, Aviva Kempner. And if I were in front of all of you and I could look at you, I would say, how many of you have seen it? But this is not that situation. As I said, I had never heard of Julius Rosenwald, nor had my husband. Both of us are Jewish. I wouldn't have believed that Julius Rosenwald was the one who had the business acumen, as Stephanie had said, to create this important enterprise. That people today say that Sears was the Amazon of the early 20th century. Actually, Amazon is the Sears of the 21st century. So we went to see it. We were blown away. And as I said, I knew about national parks. And at the end of the 90-minute film, I turned to my husband and I said, there needs to be a national park for Julius Rosenwald and the Rosenwald schools. And as I said, I knew about national parks, having visited, now it's about 333, a lot of national parks. And I knew that there was not one national park that commemorated the life and the legacy of a Jewish American, nor was there a park that dealt with education in the South for African Americans and the Rosenwald schools. So that's how it began. And another important part of the whole thing was that the National Trust for Historic Preservation in 2002 had designated the Rosenwald schools as one of the 11 most endangered historic places. The trust comes out every year with a list of 11 most endangered sites. This was important because it encouraged a number of Rosenwald schools to be restored. And there was a lot of support for that. Lowe's was one of the supporters, a lot of the states, other foundations supported the restoration of these schools. So in the summer of 2016, 4 people got together in a conference room in National Parks Conservation Association offices. 2 people represented NPCA and 2 people represented the trust. The 2 people representing NPCA were Alan Spears and myself. And the other people representing the trust, one is retired and the other is Brent Leggs, who has a very important position these days at the trust. So in 2016, we got together in the conference room and we plotted a path forward. And it was shortly after that that I met Stephanie Deutsch, and she became a member of our board. And Bob Stanton, whom I've known since 1989, was very gracious and agreed to come on board, as did a number of other National Park Service retirees, high-level people. And so the mission of the campaign is to create a multi-site National Historical Park. We want a visitor center in Chicago. Why Chicago? That's where Julius Rosenwald lived, he worked, and oversaw his philanthropy. And a small number of Rosenwald schools from those in 14 of the 15 southern states in which they were constructed. And all decisions about what the visitor center will be and what the schools, which schools will be included, will be made by the National Park Service. So, with the advice and consent of the members of the board who were had worked for the National Park Service and knew all about these issues, we went out to the 15 states in which they were built. As Stephanie mentioned, between 1912 and 1932, there were 5,357 schools, teacher homes, and shop buildings that were built in 15 states. And these states ranged from Maryland to Florida, from North Carolina to Oklahoma, from Louisiana to Missouri. And 14 of the state, and we asked them to recommend up to 5 schools from their states for possible inclusion in a national park. And 14 states made recommendations. They recommended 55 schools and a teacher home. Missouri responded, but said that only 4 schools were built in Missouri. 3 of them no longer exist, and the other one is being used in for an end purpose that's not compatible for being in the national park. And so between January 2018 and October 2019, campaign representatives visited 33 of the schools and the teacher home. We were going to visit more, particularly one in Kentucky and one in Louisiana, but COVID intervened. And so this is a sample of the Rosenwald schools that were recommended in 2017. And I'm going to use my pointer. This one up on your left, it's a 1-teacher school. It's in Louisa County in Virginia. It was being restored when we visited it in 2019. It has been fully restored now. Over to the right, where my pointer is the Noble Hill School in north of Atlanta, about an hour north of Atlanta. It's a two-teacher school. Down in the middle is a school which is very interesting. It's in Wetumpka, Alabama, which is about 16 miles north of Montgomery, Alabama. On the site is not only this very well-preserved 6-teacher school, but there's a teacher home. It wasn't a Rosenwald teacher home, but it's a teacher home, and also one of the equalization schools that were built by the southern states to say that our schools are equal, but separate. And that was a way to try to avoid integration. Down here on the bottom left is the Shiloh Rosenwald School, which is near Tuskegee, another 2-teacher school. And up on here is a 3-teacher school in the eastern shore of Maryland. It was built during the Tuskegee phase. And that is when Tuskegee had the designs and the schools were being created under their supervision. It got too big for them, and in 1920, the Rosenwald Fund moved it to Nashville. So these are examples. These are 5 of the 56 facilities that were recommended in 2017. Okay, so what else has the campaign done? In 2018, we issued a report it's called a historic context study report. Once again, the members of the board who had been high-level National Park Service employees were very instrumental in saying that this was needed. This report concluded that Julius Rosenwald and the Rosenwald schools are of national historic significance, something that Bob has already said to you. It's also a very good reference source on Julius Rosenwald, on the Rosenwald schools. It lists all the Rosenwald fellows, which I mentioned. In 2020, we came out with another report on the sites in Chicago that could be candidates for a visitor center for the Rosenwald National Historical Park. And then in 2021, we came out with our final report, which was on the Rosenwald schools that had been recommended for inclusion in the park. And this report does give a background on the whole Rosenwald School program, and it has summaries, multi-page summaries on each of the 33 facilities that we visited. All of these reports are on our website, but if you want, you can write me and I can send them to you as well. I wanted to show you one thing down here, if you can see. This is from the Community School Building Program, and each year, the fund, when it was moved to Nashville, would put out a booklet of plans for the schools. And if you wanted to build a Rosenwald school, you had to follow the plans. And they were pretty specific. Here is a 2-teacher school. You had to have 2 acres of land. You had to have privies, and they had plans for the privies as well. So just a little bit for your edification. So we've put out 3 reports in the last 6 years. And importantly, in 2020, Congress passed a law. It does not create the national park. What it does is directs the National Park Service to perform a special resource study of the sites that are associated with Rosenwald and with the schools. This little bill, had strong bipartisan support. It was introduced in the House by Representative Danny Davis in Illinois, and in the Senate by Senator Richard Durbin of Illinois. There were 10 co-sponsors in the Senate and 43 in the House. It was passed in the end of December, and it went to the president who signed it, President Trump, on January 13th, 2021. And let me go back, I'm sorry. And so the Park Service has started the special resource study. It started it in April of this year. They've had 2 public hearings, virtual public hearings that took place in July, and they had a comment period that ended on July 31st, 2022, and more than 2,000 comments were received, which I think is really quite impressive. They're working on the special resource study. They expect to have it completed by early 2024, and after that, the legislation will be introduced to create the National Historical Park. And we have been in close contact with the National Park Service ever since early 2021. And we have submitted all our data to them, all the reports, all the references and underlying data that we have, and we keep them apprised of our activities. Okay, so one of the other things that we're doing is we're collecting Rosenwald memorabilia. Most of the memorabilia that we have collected do pertain to Sears Roebuck. And I'll give you some examples here. So on your left is we bought a stereopticon and a set of 50 slides that were produced in like 1906. And they basically were advertising for Sears Roebuck. And the stereopticon costs 35 cents and the set of 50 slides costs 15 cents. And they're actually a good reference tool on the history of Sears Roebuck, at least its early history. And then we've bought a number of postcards. This middle one, well, first of all, the top one, you can see here vaguely that there's a recreation area. It's a sunken fountain, and it was for the employees of Sears, where in their off duty, they could go and enjoy themselves. Down here is a big track near the Sears facility, and it's like a quarter of a mile long, and maybe it's a quarter of a mile wide and a mile long, half a mile long, and they had annual meets there for the employees again. When Julius Rosenwald died, I don't know what that is. When Julius Rosenwald died, he was very, very well known, and we were able to get vintage original newspapers. The top one is Rosenwald Dies, and it's a banner headline, and it's the Chicago Tribune, as you would expect. But it was front page news even on the New York Times and other newspapers, and we were able to get these newspapers, as well as other newspapers that pertain to things that he did both as the head of Sears. In fact, in 1921, he rescued Sears. The word on the street, which we hear these days, was that Sears was going to go under. It was in the midst of a bad recession, and Julius Rosenwald loaned the company $20 million of his own money to save it, which he did. So here's some more artifacts that we have. We have his strong box that we received from Sears Roebuck, now called Transformco. We have a oil painting, a portrait of him. And one of the people who watched a webinar that we held from Little Rock, Arkansas, built this one teacher schoolhouse model using 3D laser printing, and he donated it to the campaign. We also have books. The Rosenwald schools, after they built them, they also developed a list of library books, both for the elementary children and for those in the in the upper grades. And we were able to buy books, they were not from the schools, but they're the books that were included in the schools, and we were able to buy copies of those books from the same time period that's relevant. And then here I want to talk about very briefly, we also received from Sears Roebuck a couple of months ago, 3 original Sears catalogs from the time period of 1911 to 1921, the time when Julius Rosenwald was the president and chairman. And one of the things that Sears, under Rosenwald's leadership and Richard Sears' leadership, instituted was satisfaction guaranteed or your money back. And the covers of these 2 catalogs go to that. On the right, with the little girl putting a letter in the mailbox to Sears Roebuck, which was not unusual, by the way. It says, "Are originators of the guarantee that stands the test in the scales of justice." So it was an upright company. Okay, so where are we? We have also gone out, and maybe as a result of tonight's webinar, we will get some more nonprofit organizations that agree to support the creation of the National Historical Park. As of Halloween, there were 173 supporting organizations. They represent a very broad and diverse group of organizations. They're here: national parks, preservation, conservation, educational groups, museums, historical societies, churches and synagogues, African American and Jewish organizations, and importantly, support groups from numerous Rosenwald schools. Our goal for this year is 175. We only have 2 to go, so help us. Ongoing activities, as I said, we're assisting the National Park Service as appropriate. And we submitted comments both as the campaign, and a number of our board members also submitted comments. I told you we want to gain more organizations, have more events like tonight, and organize museum exhibitions and add to our artifact collection. Most importantly, we want to advance the legislation to create the National Historical Park. It's an important addition to the national park system. So why a national park? And we've sort of gone into this, but repetition doesn't hurt. It is of national historic significance. It will fill important gaps in the national park system, especially 4 important gaps. It will be the first of 424 national parks. The most recent to be added, Bob mentioned, was the Blackwell School in Texas. It will be the first to commemorate a Jewish American, the first to address the impact of Rosenwald schools, the first to highlight early Black-Jewish partnerships. The partnership between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington was a very important partnership. It is a tribute to Booker T. Washington that Julius Rosenwald followed on to build the schools after Washington died unexpectedly in 1915. It was Washington's vision and passion to build these schools, but he instilled that passion in Julius Rosenwald, who carried it on until 1932. And it will focus on American philanthropy, which is something that has not been addressed in the national park system, although philanthropy has been an important part of creating and maintaining national parks and enlarging the system. So I'm going to, sorry about that. I'm going to give you two quotes to finish before the discussion begins. And the first is, education means emancipation. It means light and liberty. It means the uplifting of the soul of the man into the glorious light of truth, the light by which men can only be made free. Excuse me if I got truth wrong, but I can't see the whole thing. And this is by, and I haven't repeated it enough but it's a wonderful quote by somebody who is assisting the campaign, made us aware of a few months ago. And of course, it's from Frederick Douglass, from Blessings of Liberty and Education. And Frederick Douglass is Director Bob Stanton's hero. And it's really as important today as it was in the early 20th century. Education is what will help us get through it. Okay, and the last thing I will quote you is, all the other pleasures of life seem to wear away, but the pleasure of helping others in distress never does. And this is a quote by Julius Rosenwald. And the background, for your information, is Shenandoah National Park, outside Washington, D.C. a bit, and at sunset. And so if you want to get in touch with us, you can visit our website. You can become a subscriber. We are now almost at 1,000 subscribers who get our newsletter, which comes out 6 times a year. We'd love to have additional subscribers. Or you can write to me at dorothycanter@rosenwaldpark.org. So thank you very much for attending tonight, and I'll give it back to Alan to start the discussion. Thank you.
All right, Dorothy, thank you for that. And we have had a request to put in the contact information for the panelists into the chat, so we will manage to do that. We want to go into the panel section, but there are also a couple of questions that have been popping up on in the chat function. So please, people, keep your questions and comments coming. We'll try to work on that echo. One question that I did want to just address immediately is Louise Frank wants to know, how do you create a national park that consists of many small, very geographically separated sites? And I just refer you to the National Park Service Manhattan Project sites, which is one story about the development of the atomic bomb, but it's spread over 3 states. There's the Hannaford site in Washington, Los Alamos in New Mexico, and Oak Ridge in Tennessee. So 3 different sites that tell or contribute to the telling of the same story. So it is possible, just have to be a little bit creative about it when they are, and I can never remember what the correct word is, non-contiguous, discontiguous sites. For our panelists, Stephanie, you might know, Dorothy, you might know, how many of the Rosenwald schools that were constructed in the era are still standing?
Well, that's a great question, and it's often asked, and it's actually impossible to answer 100% accurately. When segregation ended, which of course wasn't the day after Brown versus Board, but in the 15, 20 years after that decision, the Rosenwald schools closed because they were schools for Black children. And so a variety of things happened to the buildings. Some of them passed into private hands and were bought and turned into homes or businesses. Some of them reverted to counties or to churches that had donated the land or made significant contributions. So some of them kind of fell apart and disappeared. And then in 2002, as Dorothy said, the National Trust really brought attention to the schools, and several states made very thorough inventories of the schools in their states. For example, Maryland had, I think, 153 schools, and they have 50 still standing. Most estimates are that only about 10% of them are still standing. So I can't answer that question for sure, but on the positive side of that, there are many, many places where communities and driven in large part by alumni are rallying around and wanting to preserve the schools. And one thing we didn't really hit on, but the schools were sources of tremendous pride and affection in the communities where they were created. Of course, the people who used the schools, it was their parents, it was their grandparents who'd given the money, who worked to, in some cases, had literally physically built the schools themselves. And it's extraordinary to talk to people who went to those schools and to hear the affection and the pride and so that is a great generator of the desire to preserve the schools and preserve their stories.
Well, Stephanie, on that point, if I can stick with you for a moment, in your book, you have that wonderful description where you're sharing the story of your husband's cousin. And she makes the announcement that she's going to get married, and then they do the biography of her, and it sort of shares with the people in her school that she does have a relationship to Julius Rosenwald, and the janitor comes up to her. And he's talking about the significance, the impact of Rosenwald and Rosenwald schools. Can you share that story with us, please?
Yeah, that was a story that I learned early on when I was really starting my work. My husband's cousin, Debbie, was a teacher at a school in New Jersey. And back in the day, you used to, it was announced in the paper if you were going to get married. And so someone at the school had cut the announcement out and put it on the bulletin board. And Debbie was quite taken aback when the janitor sought her out to say, "Oh my goodness, your great-grandfather was Julius Rosenwald. I just want to tell you how much that name means to me. My family went to a Rosenwald school. I can't remember where, but somewhere down south." And that kind of thing happens over and over again. This program had just a tremendous impact.
And Stephanie, thank you for that. Bob, I want to go to you. You speak with a great deal of force and passion about the significance of Julius Rosenwald and the empowerment that the schools provided for African Americans. What are we missing? Why is it not okay that Julius Rosenwald is one of the greatest philanthropists that we've never heard of, one of the greatest contributors to civil rights and to the advancement of African American education? Why is it not okay that more people aren't aware of that?
Unmute, Alan. Thank you. That would be perhaps a difficult question to answer. It could be in part attributed to his humanity and his humility. There's no indication that he promoted for the public interest or the public awareness of his benevolence. So I mean, that speaks to his humanity, to his humility, and to his genius. He was just a giant of a human being. I think that there has been, unfortunately, and I think maybe by design, not to tell the full story of the treatment, for lack of a better expression, of African Americans who sought educational opportunities, even under the doctrine of separate but equal. There's so much about the American experience that we have chosen not to really reveal for the benefit of our own understanding of the path to which we have traveled as a nation, as a people. But I think that as a people, as a nation, we are maturing in that we can better understand and appreciate our past, recognizing our difficulties, where we have stumbled, where we have erred, in anticipation or in hope that we have learned and we will build a better people and a better nation. We would in fact become better citizens. So the Julius Rosenwald story will be in the sunlight. It would tell us that, yes, we did not want to provide educational opportunities to young people because they were Black. But someone came to their aid, such as Mr. Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington and others. And that story has to be told if we are to grow and prosper as a nation and as a people.
Well, he did in fact help make a way out of no way for many people.
That's a good way to express it, Alan. Great way to
Stephanie.
express it.
Can I just add something to that? Bob, you're so right. And all of us who have come together around our admiration for Julius Rosenwald and what he accomplished, that is paired with extreme admiration for the people who actually made the schools happen.
Yes.
That for me, that has been the revelation. Rosenwald had a fascinating career, but he tapped into something that I really wasn't aware of.
Yeah.
Which was that extraordinary attitude that wasn't deterred by so many roadblocks. I mean, as you said, making a way out of no way. I mean, just they wanted schools, and by golly, they got them, and they worked to get them. And was it fair to pay taxes and then also donate to a Rosenwald school? No, it wasn't fair, but they wanted it and they did it.
Excellent point, Stephanie.
Dorothy, a question for you. Julius Rosenwald had a philanthropic philosophy to give while you live. What did he mean by that? And how did that impact his philanthropy?
Well, that plays into your previous question as well. He founded his the Julius Rosenwald Fund in 1917. It's interesting. He created the fund months after he became a member of the board of the Rockefeller Foundation, and that may have stimulated the creation of the fund. But in the founding documents, it specified that the foundation would go out of business within 25 years of his death. He believed that each generation should take care of the issues that beset that generation. The people who had the funds should take care of those issues. He did not believe in foundations that went on into perpetuity. Thank you, I can't pronounce it. Sorry about that. And so that's one of the reasons that he's not well known. He's not a Rockefeller. It wasn't a Rockefeller Fund. It wasn't Carnegie, which still exists. And the other reason, I think, is, as Bob mentioned, is he was a modest man. One of the things, he would never accept honorary doctorates. He said, I wasn't a university man. I'm not educated. It doesn't go to me. And he didn't want buildings named after him. And a very prime example of that is he was the founding donor for the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. It was a leftover building from the 1893 World's Exposition. And he had taken his children to Germany, and he took his son to a science museum in, what was it? Munich? Stephanie, thank you. In Munich, and he thought this would be a good thing for Chicago. It wasn't completed until after his death, but before his death, they wanted to name it the Rosenwald Museum, just like the Field Museum in Chicago. And he was adamant, no, you can't do it. And a fight went on, and he eventually won. So, today, many philanthropists get buildings and other things named after him. He didn't want that. And I think that plus his foundation going out of business, which were key reasons that he wasn't well remembered.
Dorothy, I want to stick with you, but it's open to Stephanie and to Bob as well. Let's talk about the Rosenwald Fellowships. What was that program all about? Who are the top stars, the rock stars from the Rosenwald Fellowships?
Well, we started a table which has not been completed yet that has 50 people. And so it's in all different fields. So let's say Langston Hughes in poetry, Ralph Waldo Ellison, the Invisible Man, James Baldwin, Zora Neale Hurston in the field of, writers and poets, Ralph Bunche, the first African-American ambassador to the UN.
Dr. John Hope Franklin.
Dr. John Hope Franklin, another one of Bob's heroes. John Hope Franklin worked on the Brown versus Board of Education.
Correct.
So did Kenneth Clark and his wife, Mamie Phipps Clark, with the very famous thing of the black dolls and the white dolls. And that was very pivotal in the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And the person who photographed those experiments, Gordon Parks, a famous photographer,
Right.
Jacob Lawrence, a famous painter. I'll let Stephanie and Bob fill in a few more.
Well, I'll add one of the early fellows was James Weldon Johnson, who of course wrote the Lift Every Voice and Sing, and was a pivotal early member of the NAACP and just an extraordinary member of this group. And then someone asked a question in the chat about W.B. Du Bois. W.B. Du Bois was an admirer of Rosenwald, and he received 2 Rosenwald fellowships. Three. Okay. He received 3 Rosenwald fellowships. One of his major works that people remember him for and admire is a very big book called Black Reconstruction in America. And if you look at that book, in the very beginning, his introductory note, he says, "I would like to give special thanks to the Rosenwald Fund, which supported this work for 2 years." So
I think W. Du Bois also was the first African-American to receive an earned Ph.D. in history from Harvard.
Yeah.
I think Ralph Bunche was a recipient of a Rosenwald Fellow.
Yes, definitely.
And he won the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating a peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis, I believe. So the list goes on and on in terms of those who benefited from the Rosenwald Fellows program. No
Can I
question.
say one more thing
Yeah.
about that? So there are all these rock stars, these people whose name we all know, but there was a whole other generation of Rosenwald Fellows who created a sort of solid block of highly accomplished people who went on to be professors and journalists and work for the government. And I was giving a talk at a retirement community in Maryland a couple of years ago, and a very distinguished gentleman at the end of my talk said, when the questions came up, he said, "You ought to mention the Rosenwald Fellows, and I'm very aware of this program because I was one." He has since died, but this was a man named Samuel Myers who used his Rosenwald Fellowship to complete his PhD in economics at Harvard. And he went on then to be a prominent member of the Johnson administration, to be president of Bowie State University. And his son also is an economist. And he and I were in touch, and his son wrote an article about how significant the Rosenwald Fellows were in creating that first generation of Black economists and people looking at that. So it's a rich story, the Fellows.
As Dorothy mentioned, there were also non-African Americans who were recipient of the Rosenwald Fellow, and I think correct me, Stephanie, Ralph Gills, I believe was his name, the courageous editor of the Atlanta paper. And I remember growing up as a youngster during the period, the height, if you will, of the civil rights movement, that paper took exceptions to Jim Crow laws, et cetera, and he was really out there. I mean, he's a hero in the African American community.
Yeah,
in
that's
terms of,
really a good
the
point. There
newspapers. Yeah,
were some white
yeah,
Rosenwald fellows. Yes, Ralph McGill of the Atlanta
McGill,
Constitution,
right.
Woody Guthrie,
yeah,
kind of random, but he was one.
yeah.
And I had another
I
one.
don't think it was really quite random because it was Southern whites. They want to give to Southern whites. And then there was a
Yeah.
catch-all category and others. It was also, I've always felt it was also interesting and meaningful that in the 30s and 40s, they were giving also a fair amount. It wasn't equal in terms of numbers, but they were giving to women as well.
Yes,
Which was not the case. Like Pauline Murray, she isn't well known, but there's a book about her called The Firebrand and the First Lady, and she was very instrumental in a number of fields. In law, she was the first Episcopalian female minister, etc. So it just goes on and on. And the thing is that it's very unfortunate, but back in that era, and it's not totally absent today, some people, perhaps most, didn't feel that African Americans could accomplish what these people accomplished. And what these fellowships help prove is that given equal opportunity, they can accomplish as much as anyone else. And that was important.
excellent, Dorothy. Excellent.
Dorothy, let's stay with the women's history on this. We've got a question in the chat about Julius Rosenwald's wife, about his family. Tell us about the wife. Tell us about the family.
Well, Stephanie will be better on that, but I can start. His wife was Augusta Nussbaum, and actually her brother was the one who gave Julius Rosenwald the opportunity of his lifetime, because Richard Sears offered, Nussbaum had made a lot of money in the 1893 Chicago World's Exposition. He had done a favor for Marshall Field, and so Marshall Field gave him the soft drink concession. So he made a lot of money, and he went to Richard Sears and he tried to sell him a device for routing all the orders. And Sears said, no, I don't want that. But I tell you what, how about buying a half interest in Sears Roebuck, because Roebuck is leaving for $75,000. And Nussbaum went to Julius Rosenwald, his brother-in-law, and said, well, hey, how about you taking half of the $75,000? And Rosenwald thought the catalog business was good. And also he had sold suits to Sears Roebuck, and Sears Roebuck owed him money. And so he got this chance of a lifetime. So that's not about his wife, but it's because of his wife that he got this once in a lifetime opportunity. Stephanie can say more. I'll just say they had 5 children. They had the first 3 and there was a gap. And then they had
Marion and William.
Marion, and then William, the youngest. So the bookends are 2 boys and 3 girls in the middle. And I'll let Stephanie, who's, is a card-carrying semi-member of the family, talk to you about that.
Rosenwald and his wife had a close relationship, and one anecdote from early on was, I think this is in Peter Ascoli's book, that Rosenwald went out. They were young, and this is before he's made all his money, and he went to some kind of meeting where donations were being solicited, and he made a rather generous donation, and he came home feeling a little guilty, like, what's his wife going to say? Because they didn't have a lot of money at the time. And her response was, don't ever feel bad about donating money. I'm always in favor of that. So she was a very generous spirited person. In fact, there's a Rosenwald school, and I can't remember where it was, that was named for Augusta Rosenwald. She traveled down to Tuskegee with him, and she was personable. People liked her. And the 5 children were all strong and distinct personalities. And I'll just mention one, that Rosenwald's oldest son, Lessing, worked his way up at Sears. And when Sears opened a branch in Philadelphia, Lessing moved to Philadelphia and ran the branch there. And when it came time for Rosenwald to choose a new president of Sears as he was retiring, Lessing was interested, and felt that it might be a obvious thing for him to take over from his father. And his father thought differently. This was one of Julius Rosenwald's interesting traits, was he wasn't mushily sentimental, and he was able to say to his son, no, I think I want to hire someone else. And it was Gussie who said to her son Lessing, you'll be better off. You won't have to move back to Chicago, and you're interested in collecting, and you can do that. Well, Lessing Rosenwald turned into a absolutely major collector of medieval art. The rare book room at the Library of Congress is named for him. The National Gallery of Art in Washington has many, many, many works that were donated by him. So it was a very interesting and very affectionate family.
Thank you for that. We have noticed now that the Texas African American Museum is watching. So Bob, you've got some home state fans rooting for you on this panel. We did also have another question, which maybe will require a little bit of cleaning up. The question is, how did he attract teachers? I'm assuming that is, how did Rosenwald attract teachers? As I assume many were secure in their present positions, did he pay well? So let's talk about the teachers that were at the Rosenwald schools, where they came from, and how they did their jobs. Stephanie, maybe we'll start with you.
That, yeah. Well, so the Rosenwald schools were public schools. So Julius Rosenwald did not administer the schools. They were public schools. And so they were administered by the localities where they existed. One of the interesting aspects in terms of the teachers was there was a program called Jean's Teachers that had been funded by a Quaker woman in Philadelphia who in, I think about 1908, left a large estate with the purpose of training specifically teachers to go out into the rural schools. And the Jean's Teachers was a tremendously important part of what happened in the schools. It had nothing to do with Rosenwald, but these teachers traveled around to these rural schools. And I talked to one woman who remembered the Jean's teacher coming to her school in Virginia and bringing her sewing machine, and she would give probably the girls, sewing lessons but the curriculum of the Rosenwald School was a public school curriculum. It was in no way different from other public schools. Secondhand books, passed down books with lots of writing and other children's names in them.
I can personally attest to that, Stephanie.
I hear that every single time I talk to Rosenwald alumni. That's classic.
Let me respond further to Alan's question. I think also it's very important to show the connection between teacher opportunities in the 5,000 Rosenwald schools that were afforded to men and women coming out of historically Black colleges and universities. With many of them been established right after the Civil War, and I think there's one or two established before the end of the Civil War. So they were seeking employment as well. I have not seen any extensive documentation on the number of teachers who came out of our historically Black colleges and universities, but I would suspect there were a significant percentage. And that was true in the more recent times in terms of the pilots and with the Tuskegee Airmen. Most of them were HBCU graduates. So it's a rich story and has all wide dimensions of the stories to be told.
For sure.
Also, the Rosenwald Fund did give grants to HBCUs to teach.
That is correct, Dorothy.
teachers.
Excellent point.
I don't know how extensive that program was, but it was part of the of their philanthropy.
Excellent.
We've got another question in the chat, and this one is, what was the response, I guess primarily in the white community, to the presence or the construction of Rosenwald schools? On the one hand, Rosenwald schools helped to lend credibility to the notion of separate but equal, but was it possible, or did it happen that there were some people in these communities that saw Rosenwald schools and any opportunities to educate Black people as a threat to the status quo?
I'll start off on that. Yes, of course. It varied. The Rosenwald fundraising drives always elicited funds from white residents as well as Black. And sometimes they got significant contributions from the white community. On the other hand, the files at Fisk University that have the files that were kept contemporaneously with the fund, they have these cards that have the amount of money that was raised by the various communities, the amount of money that was given by the Rosenwald Fund. And occasionally on these cards, you'll see the word burned. Now, these were wooden structures, and I assume that some of them burned accidentally. But no, sadly, they did sometimes arouse hostility. There's a great story about a county in, gosh, I'm not sure if it was Arkansas or Mississippi, where there was a lot of hostility. And so the decision was made to order all the equipment ahead of time and build several schools in one night, put them up in one night, so they just kind of be a fait accompli. But yeah, there was the reaction to the schools varied. Another interesting thing about that, Alan, is that the plans for the schools, the fund supplied the plans for the schools, and they had many different plans: the 1-teacher school, the 2-teacher school, the 6-teacher school, and they made those plans available to anyone who wanted them. And so there were occasionally white schools that were built on the plans sent out by the Rosenwald Fund.
Also, you know, the schools were built before the beginning of the Great Migration, but when the Great Migration of African Americans out of the South, the white governments realized that if they wanted to keep the population there as a workforce, they better provide education. And so ultimately, $28 million was spent to build these over 5,000 structures. Most of it came from the governments, the local community governments. Like 18 million came from them. And Stephanie mentioned in her talk about how more came from the African-American communities than from the Rosenwald Fund. The smallest amount came from the white individuals, and that was about $1 million. And late in the school building program campaign, and this may have been only for the bigger buildings. If you remember, one of the schools I showed was a brick building. It came out that the buildings had to be built in brick. So burning was sometimes not intentional, but other times it was. So there was mixed reaction in terms of the white communities.
Thank you. We've got only about 6 minutes left, and we've covered a lot tonight. We've also left a lot out by necessity. So I want to go in this order. Well, Bob, Stephanie, and then Dorothy, you can close us out. But closing thoughts for the folks that are with us tonight about the significance of Julius Rosenwald, the Rosenwald schools, and our campaign. And Bob, we'll start with you.
Well, I hope that we would have inspired or encouraged the listening audience to consider becoming a supporter of the campaign and certainly offering their support relative to the Park Service moving expeditiously and developing the special resource study and submitted through the necessary channels ultimately to Congress. But reflecting on the areas preserved in the national park system, they all are places of learning. And I would hope that in telling the story of Mr. Rosenwald and the Rosenwald schools and the parents, the guardian, and particularly the students who attended the school, would be a source of encouragement, a source of inspiration for our young people today. That in considering their own educational development, that they will not become discouraged and they will stay the task of attending school and graduating, knowing that their predecessors, their ancestors fought so hard for education, and they should be inspired by that. And that is my hope, that the message or the legacy told in the Rosenwald schools and his support will encourage this and future generation to, to pursue their educational development and thereby become responsible citizens in all walks of life. That's my hope.
Thank you, sir. Stephanie?
Gosh, there's so many things I could say. One thing we haven't really talked about, but that I think is something that will come out of the park and of more attention to Rosenwald, was these schools produced men and women who were not just educated, they were good citizens.
Yes.
And out of the schools came men and women who supported the civil rights movement.
Right.
Bob mentioned John Lewis, but he wasn't the only one. And they were, we're so used to thinking of course, the civil rights movement had magnificent leaders, but it existed because of the men and women who registered to vote when it was an unpopular thing to do, who joined the NAACP, who had the civil rights workers sleep in their basement or whatever. And a lot of these people went through Rosenwald schools. They were educated because of the schools, and they were educated not to self-interest so much. They were educated to be good citizens. And I think that's a tremendous legacy. And I think that in this time when we're committed to a fuller retelling of American history, and much of that involves stories that are difficult and that are painful, this is a story that has so much that is something of which people can take enormous pride. And it's a story that certainly comes out of the dark places of our history, but shows people at their best.
Stephanie, thank you for that. Dorothy, close us out. And
Okay, well,
remind people how they can support the campaign as
I
well.
will, thank you, because I happened to look at the chat and I saw one of the questions. This is a truly American story. It's sort of only in America from many different standpoints. The son of immigrants, seeking refuge and freedom from persecution and opportunity in this country. Story of somebody who never graduated from high school. The story of these communities, as Stephanie has said, and Bob thirsted for education for their children. It's such a positive story about how we can, when we're at our best, work to make this country a more perfect union. And it's a story that is really relevant right now. And so all of us, to be at our best, should try to do these sorts of things to make America better. One of the questions was, how can organizations express support? If you are aware of an organization that might be willing to support, lend its support for creating the park, we're not asking for anything other than a letter of support. We're not asking for money from organizations. You can write to me at Dorothy Canter at rosenwaldpark.org. You can find, or just get info on our website. We would like to get more people, who I said, are subscribers. And we welcome you to be a part of Team Rosenwald, to work together with us to get this important story out and part of the national park system, and to help make America the more perfect union. And we're very grateful to OLLI, Berkshire, and all the rest for giving us this opportunity to connect with you. And we hope that it has been a good experience for all of you. Thank you very much.
Stephanie Deutsch, Dorothy Canter, and Bob Stanton. I'm Alan Spears. And Carol, we'll turn it back over to you to formally close out the program. But thanks, everyone. And thank you, my friends.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan.
Thanks.
Thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful evening. We are so grateful for all of your passion and expertise shared with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.